Okay. Half of you know me. You know me because I'm actually a member here at Christ Church Cathedral. And so my name is Tom Kent. I am the managing director at Elementz, which is a hip-hop center located just up the street and over the Rhine. Been around for 17 years. I'm involved with them because the cathedral was involved with them, and got more involved as I followed where our money was going and tried to understand how I could be helpful for the organization, and I eventually ended up working for them. I'm only half of our leadership team. The other half is Abdullah Powell, who's our creative director. And I wore my hoodie today because I needed to get just a little street cred for you, because you can tell I'm not from the street. So I'm going to talk about Elementz and why I feel that we're right in the middle of disruptive social change. That is, it is what we do, but we do it through hip-hop. We work with teenagers to accomplish this. So if you're in Cincinnati in 2001, you may remember when Timothy Thomas was shot by the police and over the Rhine erupted in riots. This is a picture that was painted by the man on the left with the red coat on. He's standing in front of his art store at Findlay Market and pleading with the rioters not to break into his store. And he was successful. And they did not break in, even though they were breaking into all the stores around. And I have this up here because Elementz is actually born out of this particular event. And it has colored everything we've done ever since. This particular mural is on the wall in our center. We're located just next to Findlay Market. And in the middle of the faces here is Timothy Thomas. He was a teenager when he was shot and killed by the police on 14th and Republic Streets, just about 4 blocks from where we're located right now. And because of that, the 2 young men in the bottom who were holding a camera came together. They were community activists in over the Rhine, and first, anger. Secondly, what can we do, and how can we make better things happen in our neighborhood? So the Over the Rhine that we see today is not the Over the Rhine of that day. Over the Rhine was in bad shape. A lot of it was devoted to drug deals. Most of the kids that lived in that area were high school dropouts. And about the only activity back in 2001 for kids to do after school was to sell drugs and be part of gangs. Very dangerous activity. If you stayed in it long enough and you survived it, you'd end up in jail more than likely. That's what we saw. But not everyone survived it. It was easy to get shot. A lot of the kids that came to Elementz in the beginning came into us with no high school degree. They had been shot while they were dealing drugs, or they were about to and felt the threat. And the call to get off the street and change a life that didn't end up in prison or dead was appealing to them. So these 2 guys, in the course of trying to figure out what they were going to do for the community, they took on some projects. And let me just prompt myself by putting them up here. In 2002, their first project was to organize a nonprofit called Control, which means Citizens Organizing Neighborhoods to Regain Our Liberation. That's pretty revolutionary right there. And that is Elementz. Elementz, that was our first name. We actually had a name change along the way. And I actually am pretty excited and proud of the fact that we began out of fire and destruction, but it was that fire and the spirit to make change, positive change happen, that has propelled us ever since. Their first project was Cop Watch. In that picture I just showed you, they were holding a camera. This is back before cell phones. And they gave it out to residents to photograph what was going on with the police and residents at the time, which was not good. And their second project was to have a block party for local residents to bring the community together. They got all the permits, had it up on McMicken Street, But the police, in spite of the fact that they were there illegally, drove their squad cars right down the middle of the street, cleared everybody to the side, almost hitting kids and parents, and then arrested 3 people that were there. This is all anger over the cameras. So that was the first couple of projects we did. The next thing we started working on was voter registration and projects around youth leadership. So as the founders began working in the community, they realized that they were anxious to make real change happen, and voter registration was the first thing they could work on. And to this day, every time we have an election, I still see one of the original members walking down the street over the Rhine with their clipboard of voter registration sheets. So that kind of stuck, and that was great. And for years, we had voter registration drives in over the Rhine, particularly among the residents and the youth. In 2005, after further discussion with the community, they decided there would need to be a place to get youth off the street, so they rented the basement, unheated basement of the Old Burger Beer Brewing Company at Liberty and Central Parkway. And that's where Christ Church came in, because that was the first time we connected with them as the cathedral. We were the cathedral then. And one of our members was a real estate agent. He actually found that spot, and we wrote their first grant. The dean at the time gave them a check to help pay their rent for the first year. So they opened up this basement with this plywood studio, and the kids from the neighborhood flocked in. And at that time, as I said, almost everybody was a high school dropout. We can fast forward several years to about 2015, 2014, and we were seeing 100% graduation from high school. Up until that time, we ran GED programs to help kids get their high school degree. We had to discontinue the program because everyone was graduating. And I'll tell you a little more about what happened after everybody started graduating from high school. In 2008, Elementz Arts Wave, the arts organization in Cincinnati, also at the time might have been known as the Fine Arts Fund, realized that there was a lack of diversity in the arts community, and they made a deliberate effort to fund 6 African-American organizations to see if they could bring them into the fold and help mentor them to grow their organizations and strengthen them. One of those organizations was Elementz. For Elementz, that became life-changing, particularly for the kids, because now there was an embrace by the community. More importantly to me, it was an embrace of the community of their particular art form. And it took a stretch at the time for anybody to think that hip-hop was art. But we made that jump, and I have some slides about that I'll show you in a minute. In 2012, we moved across the street from the School for the Creative and Performing Arts. We needed a bigger spot. At that point, we began connecting to all the arts institutions in Cincinnati, and the disruptive part of our mission at that point changed because we thought that we could get the kids from the street using their native art forms into places like Music Hall and the Aeronaut and perform and integrate them into the arts community in general. And in fact, that is what we were actually successful in doing that. And I have some pictures of those things. Almost the last thing I want to say about this, in 2014, the next disruptive move we made was to look at our kids who are creative and think about, if you're off the street, you come in here to rap or produce a beat or learn some dance steps or choreograph a hip-hop dance, and that's what you do at 14, what do people who have creative skills at 14, what do they do when they're 24? Well, if you're not from the street and you go to a suburban school, at 24 and you're creative, you're working at branding, marketing, design, and architecture companies. That's what creative people do. Then we looked at those companies and looked at their employees and saw that less than 3% of them were minorities. And we knew from working with our group, who represents 50% of the teenagers in Cincinnati, that there was a clear discrepancy in kids who grew up on the street and had to go to the non-magnet high schools, like Taft High School, and did not end up having a good job with a creative career. Although the same 14-year-old who liked these same things, was creative, who went to a suburban school, did end up in those companies. So that was the next move for us, was to start a program called Creative Futures, where we actually took our 14 and 15-year-olds and we introduced them to creative companies and creative careers. We helped to find people who looked like them in those companies so they could start to imagine themselves with those kinds of jobs. We also took them to college campuses, to UC, where they could actually imagine themselves on the campus and being a student. This is the most important program. We started then. It is what consumes us today. It's almost all we work on. And that's because it's working. Finally, in 2015, our citywide program, Louder Than a Bomb, started. We just finished our 5th year of that. It was also the point where we stopped working just in our center and over the Rhine and began working in high school. So now more than 50% of our programming is done in the high schools. Louder Than a Bomb is a citywide poetry contest, and kids from any high school can form a team. It's like being on a sports team. You start in August, you work all year, and then in April, you compete down at the Freedom Center for prizes. All about poetry, but performance poetry, which in the hip-hop world we call spoken word. I'm going to go through these slides fairly quick because I actually don't think I have ever talked about Elementz in less than 45 minutes. But I don't feel like I'm a good representative of what's going on because I don't look like a young kid from the street. So I like to have lots of pictures. These are our kids. Every one of them is, to me, is totally exciting. And we say to the public, we're bringing a youthful freshness to the community's arts culture. What we say to the public is one thing. We're always talking about performance art, affecting the city's art culture. But for the kids, what we're thinking about is how do we put you into leadership and have you in charge of what's going on in the city and not just being receiving things that people want to give you. One of the arguments we've used in the arts world where they're trying to say, now is hip-hop really art, is help people understand that you don't have to understand hip-hop. You don't even have to like it. But whether you like hip-hop or the opera or the symphony, like I go to the symphony, so that's what I like. That all of us who appreciate creativity and art, it brings us all together, and we all can be in one room in one place of passion around the fact that arts has a really broad umbrella. These are our kids right here, on this slide, who are dancing at the Aeronaut Theater with the Cincinnati Ballet. I'm sure most of you may have been to the Nutcracker, whether you've been to the ballet's version or not, but you probably don't know that our kids actually choreographed these scenes, some of the scenes in the Nutcracker. And in this particular picture, the mice that are dancing around here are actually our students who are on stage with the Cincinnati Ballet. This set of slides I'm using right now, I use when I'm talking to people about the ArtsWave campaign. So I'm using ArtsWave's language, but I think it actually works. When I say in these slides for ArtsWave, I always say arts puts Cincinnati on the map, but actually you could easily say Elementz does the same thing. Up in the upper left-hand corner, that's kids, street dancers from all over the country coming here to Cincinnati in a competition that we sponsored for the last 3 years, competing on the street with freestyle dance. In the upper right, we got our dancers who are in Chicago, and then later in Las Vegas, competing with hip-hop, where they actually did really, really well on a national stage. I've already talked about our hip-hop mice with the ballet, but this particular picture is when that ballet went to New York City and got reviewed there, as people came and commented that this was an interesting way to choreograph this scene. Art's deep roots in the culture, and that's what we talk about ourselves. It's trying to integrate our kids into the culture in general and introduce their culture. We do not want our kids to become like everyone else. We want everyone else to appreciate the gifts that the street kids bring to them. So these are just an example of several places that you'll find our kids. We also work hard frankly, as an African-American organization, we work really hard to introduce what we do in our art forms that we call Native American art onto